Ambassador Velshara Kieth stood at the window of her estate and watched the twin suns of Vestra 7 sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that would have taken the breath away from any visitor who saw them for the first time. She did not care about the sunset. She cared about the message on her datapad that informed her a new bodyguard would arrive within the hour. A human bodyguard. Velshara let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a growl, her four eyes narrowing with amusement and irritation in equal measure. And she turned away from the window to face her senior advisor. Silthan was a Krethki, a creature that resembled a tall insect with gleaming black armor and compound eyes that reflected the fading light. And he had served Velshara for nearly 40 years with a loyalty that was purchased fresh each month with generous payments. A human, Velshara said, and the translator implant in her throat converted the clicking sounds of her native language into words that echoed through the vast chamber. The Galactic Security Council has sent me a human. They are considered reliable, Silthan offered, his mandibles clicking in a way that suggested he did not believe his own words. They are considered disposable, Velshara corrected him. Short-lived creatures from a planet that only achieved faster than light travel 2 centuries ago. And now they scatter across the galaxy like seeds in the wind, taking jobs that no one else wants. She walked across the polished floor of her study, her long robes trailing behind her like liquid shadow. And she stopped before a display case that held one of her most prized possessions. The crimson tear of Vethkar gleamed in its containment field. A gemstone, the size of her thumb, that glowed with an inner fire that never dimmed. And it was worth more than most beings would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. Velshara was a collector. Her estate on Vestra 7 was filled with treasures from across the galaxy. Rare artifacts and priceless works of art and items of power that had been gathered over 300 years of careful accumulation. And every single piece had been acquired through cunning and patience and an absolute understanding of one simple truth: everyone had a price. The Krethki could be bought with credits, and the Morvani could be bought with status, and the Silith could be bought with information. And in all her long life, Velshara had never met a being who could not be corrupted if you found the right pressure point and applied the right amount of force. She had cycled through 17 bodyguards. In the past 3 years alone, the first had been caught selling information about her security protocols to a rival ambassador, and she had him executed. And the second had been seduced by an agent of the Trade Consortium, and she had him exiled to a prison moon. And the pattern had repeated itself over and over again until she had grown tired of even being disappointed. Now they sent her a human. Perhaps they thought she would not bother to test such an insignificant creature. Or perhaps they genuinely believed that humans were different from other species in some fundamental way. Either way, Velshara intended to discover the truth. The door to her study slid open, and her security chief, a scarred Morvani named Gresh, stepped inside with a human male. Following close behind the human was smaller than Velshara had expected. He stood perhaps 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and close-cropped dark hair and a face that was weathered in the way of someone who had spent time in difficult places. And his eyes were a pale gray color that reminded her of storm clouds over the acid seas of her homeworld. He carried a single duffel bag over one shoulder and wore a standard security uniform that had been modified to fit his frame. And when he entered the room, his eyes moved in a quick sweep that took in every corner and shadow and potential threat before settling on her. Ambassador Kieth, Gresh said, "This is Sergeant Marcus Cole, assigned to your personal security detail by the Galactic Security Council." The human set down his bag and stood at attention with his hands clasped behind his back. And he met her gaze without flinching, even though she knew that her appearance was unsettling to many species. Velshara was tall and slender with skin that shifted colors. depending on her mood, currently a deep blue that indicated mild interest. And her face was dominated by 4 large eyes arranged in a diamond pattern above a mouth filled with small, sharp teeth. And most creatures found her beautiful in a terrifying way. "Sergeant Cole," she said, "you understand the nature of this assignment." "Yes, ma'am." His voice was steady and calm. "Personal protection detail for a diplomatic official rated at the highest threat level, with additional responsibility for state security coordination, and you understand that I have had difficulties with previous bodyguards." I read the briefing materials. "Ma'am." Valshara moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the small scars on his hands and the subtle tension in his shoulders. And she studied him the way she might study a new acquisition. 17 bodyguards, she said. Each one failed me in some way, and each one paid the price for that failure. And I'm beginning to think that the universe simply does not contain beings who can be trusted. The human did not look away from her, and he did not seem nervous. And he did not offer reassurances or promises that he would be different. And instead, he simply said, "I understand." "Ma'am, do you?" Valshara let a note of amusement creep into her voice. "You are far from your homeworld, Sergeant. Surrounded by species who could kill you without effort. Working for someone who does not trust you and does not expect you to last more than a month. And yet, you stand there as if none of this bothers you. Permission to speak freely." "Ma'am, granted, I was not sent here to be trusted," the human said. "I was sent here to do a job, and whether you trust me or not does not change what that job requires. So I will do my duty, and you can make your own judgments about my character based on my actions rather than my words." Valshara stared at him for a long moment, and then she laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Very well, Sergeant Cole," she said. "Gresh will show you to your quarters and explain the security protocols. And we will see how long your confidence lasts." She turned away from him and walked back to her window to watch the last light fade from the sky. And she was already planning the first test because everyone had a price and she intended to find his. Marcus Cole had been on the job for 3 days when he found the gemstone, was conducting his morning security sweep of the ambassador's private study, checking the windows and scanning the walls for surveillance devices and making sure that nothing had changed since his last inspection. When he noticed the crimson tear of Vethkar sitting on the edge of her desk, it was not in its display case. It was simply lying there in the open, glowing softly with that strange inner fire. And Marcus knew from his briefing materials that this single stone was worth approximately 7 billion galactic credits. He stood very still for a moment and looked at it. Then he pulled out his datapad and logged the item's position and condition, made a note that it had been removed from its secure display, and continued his patrol without touching it from a hidden room 3 floors above. Valshara watched the entire scene through her surveillance feeds. Her skin flickered through several colors in quick succession, shifting from the blue of interest to the orange of surprise to the green of confusion. And she leaned forward in her chair as the human simply walked away from a fortune that would have set him up for life. Perhaps he did not recognize it, Sylphan suggested from his position beside her. "He logged it," Valshara replied. "He knew exactly what it was. Then he is waiting for a better opportunity." Perhaps she was not convinced. Over the following week, Valshara conducted the same test 3 more times, each time leaving the gemstone in a different location where Marcus would find it during his rounds. And each time the result was the same. He noted its position and moved on the 4th occasion. She left a datapad beside it with the appraisal documents clearly visible, showing the exact value of the stone and the fact that it could not be traced once sold. And she watched as Marcus glanced at the screen and saw the number and then continued his patrol without any change in his expression. 7 billion credits, enough to buy a private moon and live like a king for the rest of his natural life, and the lives of his children and grandchildren after him. And the human had looked at that number as if it meant nothing. Velshara did not understand. She called Silthan to her chambers that evening and paced back and forth across the room while her advisor watched with the patient stillness of his kind. "It makes no sense," she said. "Every being has a price, and the price of a human should be low because their lives are short and their needs are simple. But I have offered him more wealth than he could ever spend, and he does not even hesitate. Perhaps he fears being caught." Silthan offered. "Caught by whom?" Velshara snapped. "I am the one leaving the treasures out, and I have made it clear that my security is imperfect. And if he took the stone and fled tonight, he would be 3 systems away before anyone even noticed it was missing. Then perhaps he is simply waiting for the right moment. He has had a dozen right moments." Velshara stopped pacing and stared out the window at the night sky, where the distant lights of orbital stations twinkled among the stars, and she tried to understand what was happening inside the head of the strange human who had come to work for her. She had built her entire life on the principle that everyone could be corrupted. It was not cynicism, but simply observation, a truth that had been proven to her over and over again across 3 centuries of dealing with every species in the known galaxy. And she had never once encountered an exception. Her previous bodyguards had fallen to various temptations within weeks of their assignments, some to greed and some to lust and some to the simple pleasure of feeling powerful. And she had always known exactly which lever to pull to reveal their true nature. But the human was different. He did not seem to want anything except to do his job well. And Velshara found this deeply unsettling in a way she could not quite explain. She decided to escalate her testing over the following month. She began leaving increasingly valuable items where Marcus would encounter them during his duties. Not just the gemstone, but also vials of Nexarin immortality elixir worth millions and untraceable bearer bonds and ancient technology that predated the formation of the hegemony itself. Each time, the result was the same. The human documented the item, ensured its security, and went about his business without showing any interest in acquiring it for himself. Velshara began watching him more closely, studying his behavior through the surveillance feeds, trying to understand what made him different from every other being she had ever employed. She noticed that he ate his meals alone in the security station, and that he spent his free time reading military history texts on his personal datapad. And she noticed that he was polite but distant with the other members of her staff, and that he never engaged in gossip or complained about his working conditions. She noticed that he checked the locks on her chambers 3 times each night, even though once would have been sufficient. And she noticed that he always positioned himself between her and any potential threat, even when the threat was nothing more than a servant carrying a tray of food. He was exactly what he appeared to be: professional, who took his job seriously and did not allow himself to be distracted by temptation. Velshara hated him for it. No, that was not quite right. She was fascinated by him in a way that bothered her deeply, because he represented something she had always believed impossible. And if he was real, then perhaps her understanding of the universe was incomplete. She could not accept there had to be a weakness somewhere, a crack in the armor that she could exploit, a price that would make him abandon his principles and prove that he was just like everyone else. She would find it. She simply needed to look harder. 2 months into his assignment, Marcus Cole was summoned to Ambassador Velshara's private chambers for what he was told would be a routine security briefing. He arrived at the appointed hour and found the ambassador waiting for him in a room filled with soft light and comfortable furniture. And she was not alone. A Silas female reclined on a couch near the window, her skin shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in hypnotic rhythms. and her large, dark eyes watched Marcus with an interest that was impossible to misunderstand. A Morvani male stood near the bar, tall and muscular with the kind of physical perfection that his species was known for. And he smiled at Marcus with lips that promised pleasure beyond imagination, and in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, a human woman with features so beautiful they seemed almost unreal watched him with eyes that held both invitation and challenge. "Sergeant Cole," Velshara said, and her voice was smooth as silk. "I thought you might enjoy some company this evening. As a reward for your excellent service." Marcus looked at the three beings who had been arranged for his benefit, and then he looked at the ambassador, and his expression did not change. "With respect, ma'am. I am on duty. I am giving you the night off. Then I will return to my quarters and rest. But I do not require companionship." Velshara's skin shifted to a shade of deep purple that Marcus had learned to associate with frustration, and she waved her hand in a dismissive gesture that sent the three beautiful creatures filing out of the room. "You are a strange man, Sergeant Cole." "So I have been told, ma'am. Most beings would not refuse such an offer." "I am not most beings." Velshara stood and walked toward him, her robes flowing around her like water, and she stopped close enough that he could smell the alien perfume she wore. Something sweet and slightly intoxicating that made the back of his mind feel fuzzy. "What do you want?" she asked, and her voice was low and curious. "I have offered you wealth and I have offered you pleasure, and you have refused both without hesitation. So tell me what it is that you desire, and I will give it to you. I want nothing from you except the opportunity to do my job." "Ma'am, everyone wants something, perhaps. But what I want is not something you can give me." Velshara tilted her head, her four eyes studying him with an intensity that would have made most beings look away. "And what is that?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to be someone I can respect when I look in the mirror. And that is not something that can be bought or given, only earned." The ambassador stared at him for a long time, and then she laughed, but this time the sound was different than before, less mocking and more genuinely surprised. "You may go, Sergeant." Marcus nodded and left the room, and Velshara stood alone in the soft light and tried to make sense of what she had just heard. The next day, she instructed Sylphan to arrange a different kind of test. A junior member of her household staff approached Marcus during his patrol and offered him a small vial of dream song, an illegal stimulant that was popular among humans because it enhanced their senses and made them feel invincible for hours at a time. Marcus declined a week later. Another staff member approached him with an offer to split the profits from a smuggling operation that used the ambassador's diplomatic shipping channels, something that would be impossible for the authorities to detect and would make both of them wealthy. Marcus declined. A maintenance worker confided that he had discovered a flaw in the estate's accounting systems that would allow small amounts of credits to be siphoned off without anyone noticing, and he offered to share the technique if Marcus would keep quiet about it. Marcus reported the worker to Gresh, and the flaw was corrected, and the worker was dismissed each time Velshara received the reports of these failed temptations. Her confusion grew deeper, and her frustration began to transform into something else, something that felt uncomfortably like respect. She called Marcus to her study one evening, not to test him, but simply to talk. And she found herself asking questions she had never asked any of her previous bodyguards. "Where did you come from?" "Sergeant Cole, Earth, ma'am. Specifically a region called the Pacific Northwest." "And why did you leave?" "I was recruited into the Galactic Security Forces after completing my military service, and the pay was better, and the opportunities were greater than anything I could find at home." "You left your world for money." "I left my world because there was nothing holding me there," Marcus said. And for the first time, Velshara heard something in his voice that sounded like sadness. My parents died when I was young, and I have no siblings, and the woman I loved married someone else while I was deployed. So when the recruiters came, I saw no reason to say no. Yet you refuse the wealth I offer you now. The money I earn through honest work is enough for my needs. And I have learned that taking shortcuts only leads to places I do not want to go. Learn from experience. Yes, ma'am. Velshara wanted to ask what experience he meant, but something in his expression told her not to push. And so she simply nodded and let the silence stretch between them. You are making my job harder. Ambassador, Marcus said suddenly, and Velshara blinked in surprise. Excuse me, the tests, the temptations, the people you send to compromise me, they are making it harder for me to focus on protecting you, because I am constantly having to deal with distractions that should not exist. You know what I have been doing. I am not stupid. Ma'am, and after the third beautiful stranger approached me with an impossible offer, I began to see a pattern. Velshara felt her skin flush, a color she had not worn in decades, a shade of pale pink that indicated embarrassment. And she turned away from him so he would not see it. And yet you stayed. I gave my word that I would protect you for 1 year. And I do not break my word, even though I have been trying to corrupt you. Even so, she turned back to face him. And in that moment, something changed between them. Some invisible barrier that had existed since his first day began to crack. And Velshara found herself looking at Marcus Cole, not as a test subject or a potential disappointment, but as something far more rare, a genuine mystery. Why? She asked. And her voice was soft. Why is your word so important to you? Marcus looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm, because it is the only thing I have that cannot be taken from me. And because without it I am nothing. Velshara did not know what to say for the first time in 300 years. She had encountered something she could not buy and could not manipulate and could not understand. And she was not sure whether to be frightened or relieved. The Festival of Dying Stars was the largest celebration on Vestra 7, a time when the elite of the galaxy gathered to watch the spectacular death of a distant sun and to conduct the kind of business that only happened when powerful beings came together in one place. Ambassador Velshara's estate was filled with guests, diplomats from 17 worlds mingled in her grand ballroom, their translators working overtime to convert the dozen languages being spoken into something everyone could understand. And servants moved through the crowd, carrying trays of exotic foods and drinks that cost more than most workers earned in a year. Marcus Cole stood near the wall and watched everything. He did not eat or drink, and he did not engage in conversation with the beautiful guests who occasionally approached him with curious looks. And he kept his attention focused on the ambassador as she moved through the room like a queen among her court. His instincts had been screaming at him all evening. Something was wrong. He could not point to any specific evidence. But after 20 years of combat experience in some of the most dangerous places in the galaxy, Marcus had learned to trust the voice in the back of his head that told him when trouble was coming. 3 members of the catering staff caught his attention. They moved differently than the others, with a precision and awareness that spoke of training rather than service experience. And when he watched closely, he noticed that their eyes kept returning to the ambassador with an intensity that went beyond professional interest. Marcus activated his communicator on the private channel he shared with Gresh, security concern, 3 catering staff, 2 females and 1 male, currently positioned near the east entrance. Gresh's voice came back immediately. Confirmed, I see them. What is your assessment? Unknown threat. But they are not what they appear to be. I am moving to intercept. He pushed away from the wall and began making his way through the crowd, keeping his movements casual so as not to alert the potential threats. But he had only taken a few steps when one of the females made her move. She pulled a blade from beneath her serving tray, a molecular disruption knife that glowed faintly blue along its edge. And she lunged toward the ambassador with a speed that was far beyond human capability. Marcus was faster. He crossed the remaining distance in 3 long strides and tackled Velshara to the ground, his body covering hers as the blade whistled through the air where her head had been a fraction of a second earlier. And then the world exploded into chaos. The other 2 assassins drew their weapons, and the crowd began to scream and run. And Marcus found himself facing 3 trained killers with nothing but his standard issue sidearm and the desperate need to keep the ambassador alive. He did not think, he simply acted. The first assassin came at him again with her blade, and he deflected it with his forearm, accepting the shallow cut that opened along his skin. And then he drove his elbow into her throat with enough force to crush her windpipe, and she dropped to the ground, gasping for air that would not come. The male attacked from the left, and Marcus pivoted to meet him, firing 2 shots from his sidearm that the assassin dodged with inhuman reflexes. And then they were grappling hand to hand while the third killer circled looking for an opening. Marcus felt the second blade slide between his ribs. The pain was immediate and intense, a cold fire that spread through his chest as the molecular disruption began to break down his cells. But he had been hurt before, and he did not let it slow him down. He grabbed the male assassin's head and twisted with all his strength, and the crack of breaking vertebrae echoed through the suddenly quiet ballroom. And then he turned to face the last threat with blood streaming down his side and his vision beginning to blur at the edges. The third assassin hesitated. She looked at her 2 companions on the ground, and she looked at the human who should have been dying, but who stood ready to continue fighting. And something in her expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty. It was enough. Gresh appeared behind her with a stun baton and dropped her to the ground with a single blow. And suddenly it was over. And the only sounds were the moaning of the wounded assassin and the frantic beating of Marcus Cole's heart. He stayed on his feet long enough to confirm that the ambassador was unharmed. And then the world tilted sideways, and he found himself on his knees with Velshara's hands on his shoulders. "You are injured." Her voice sounded strange, almost frightened. "Yes, ma'am." "You are bleeding badly." "Yes, ma'am." "You put yourself between me and those blades. You could have died." Marcus looked up at her, and through the fog of pain, he managed to speak clearly enough that she could understand him. "That is my job, ma'am." Velshara stared at him with all 4 of her eyes wide with an emotion he had never seen her display before. And then she was shouting for medical assistance and ordering her guards to secure the surviving assassin for interrogation. And Marcus let himself slump against the floor as the adrenaline began to fade. He had taken a molecular blade across his ribs. The wound was deep and serious, and without immediate treatment, it would kill him within hours. And he knew this with the calm certainty of someone who had faced death before, but the ambassador was safe. That was all that mattered. The medical team arrived and began working on him. And Velshara refused to leave his side, even when her advisors urged her to move to a secure location. And the last thing Marcus saw before the sedatives took effect was her face hovering above him with an expression that looked almost like concern when he woke up in the medical bay 12 hours later. She was still there. "You saved my life," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" It was the same question she had asked him so many times before. But this time, there was something different in her voice. Something that sounded almost desperate. Marcus looked at her through the haze of painkillers and regeneration drugs that were slowly repairing the damage to his body. And he gave her the same answer he had always given, "Because protecting you is my job. And I gave my word that I would do it." Velshara was silent for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched his hand, a gesture of connection that he knew was significant for her species. And when she spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "No one has ever been willing to die for me before." "Then you have been working with the wrong people." "Ma'am," she laughed, but there was no mockery in the sound this time. "Only wonder. Perhaps I have been." The interrogation of the surviving assassin revealed truths that shook the foundations of Velshara's world. The attack had not been ordered by a rival power or a foreign enemy. It had been funded by 3 members of her own council. Sylphan was the first to be arrested, dragged from his chambers in the middle of the night by security forces loyal to Gresh, and his compound eyes reflected nothing but cold calculation as he was brought before the ambassador in chains. "You tried to have me killed," Velshara said, and her voice was flat and empty of emotion. "You had grown soft," Sylphan replied. "Your obsession with the human was distracting you from your duties, and the council decided that a change in leadership was necessary for the good of the hegemony. The council, 3 of us, agreed that the time had come, and we pooled our resources to hire the best assassins in the sector. And we would have succeeded if not for your pet human." Velshara felt her skin shift through a dozen colors as rage and betrayal and confusion warred within her, and she had to take several deep breaths before she could speak again. "He refused you." Sylphan's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "We offered him 20 million credits to simply take a single night off, to look the other way while our agents did their work. And he refused without a moment of hesitation. 20 million credits. The number hung in the air between them. And Velshara found herself thinking about all the tests she had conducted over the past 3 months, all the treasures she had left out, and all the temptations she had arranged. She had been trying to prove that Marcus Cole was just like everyone else, that he could be bought if only she found the right price. And all along he had been protecting her from threats she had not even known existed. "Take him away," she ordered. And the guards dragged Sylphan out of her sight. The other 2 conspirators were arrested within the hour, and Velshara spent the rest of the night reviewing the evidence of their betrayal, tracing the web of corruption and conspiracy that had been growing under her nose while she was distracted by her attempts to corrupt an incorruptible man. When morning came, she went to the medical bay. Marcus was sitting up in his bed, reading something on his datapad, and he looked up when she entered with an expression that was politely attentive, but gave nothing away. "Ambassador, how are you feeling?" "Sergeant Cole, the doctors say I will be fully recovered within a week. The molecular damage was extensive, but the regeneration therapy is working." Velshara pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down. And for a long moment she simply looked at him, studying the face of the man who had changed everything she thought she knew about the universe. "Sylphan told me about the offer," she said finally. 20 million credits to look the other way for 1 night. Marcus nodded. "I was going to include it in my report, but I wanted to gather more evidence first. You knew there was a conspiracy. I suspected, but I did not have proof until the attack. And you said nothing to me. I was not certain who I could trust. And I did not want to make accusations without evidence." Velshara felt something break inside her. Some wall that she had built around her heart over 3 centuries of learning that trust was a weakness and loyalty was a commodity to be purchased. "You could have taken the money," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "You could have been wealthy beyond imagination, and you could have disappeared to some distant world where no one would ever find you. And instead, you took a blade in the ribs to save someone who had spent 3 months trying to prove that you were corrupt." Marcus set down his datapad and looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "Permission to speak freely." "Ma'am, always you were not trying to prove that I was corrupt," he said. "You were trying to prove that everyone is corrupt. Because if that is true, then you do not have to feel bad about the things you have done and the way you have lived your life." Velshara opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. "I am not better than anyone else," Marcus continued. I have made mistakes, and I have done things I regret, and there have been times when I was tempted to take the easy path. But I learned a long time ago that the easy path always leads somewhere I do not want to go. And where does the hard path lead? Here. Apparently, he smiled, and it was the first time Velshara had seen him smile. And she found that it changed his entire face in a way that made him look younger and softer, and somehow more real. I have lived for 300 years, she said slowly. I have dealt with every species in the known galaxy, and I have accumulated wealth and power and influence that most beings cannot even imagine. And in all that time, I have never met anyone like you. There are plenty of humans like me. Ma'am, are there? Yes, we are not special or unique. We are simply people who made a choice to live according to certain principles. And we keep making that choice every day, even when it would be easier to do something else. Velshara was quiet for a long time, thinking about what he had said, and then she made a decision that surprised even herself. Your contract is for 1 year, she said. I would like to extend it permanently. Marcus raised an eyebrow. In what capacity? Head of my entire security apparatus, with full authority over all personnel and operations. But also something more. Ma'am, I want you to be my advisor. Someone who will tell me the truth, even when I do not want to hear it. Someone who cannot be bribed, or threatened, or manipulated into telling me what I want to believe. That is a dangerous position. Ma'am, truth-tellers tend to have short careers. Not if they work for someone who has finally learned to value truth. Marcus studied her for a long moment. And Velshara had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing straight through her, reading every thought and intention that she tried to hide. What changed? He asked. You did. Or rather, you showed me something I did not believe existed. And what is that? Integrity, she said. And the word felt strange in her mouth, like a foreign language she was only beginning to learn. Not as a negotiating position or a mask or a tool to be used when convenient, but as something real, something worth more than all the treasures in my collection. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. I will stay. Ambassador, but I have one condition. Name it. No more tests. No more temptations. No more trying to find my price. Because I have already shown you that I do not have one. And continuing to look for it would be an insult to both of us. Velshara felt, her skin flush with that unfamiliar shade of pink that indicated embarrassment. And she nodded quickly. Agreed. Then we have a deal. She stood and started to leave. But at the door she paused and looked back at him. Sergeant Cole. Ma'am, thank you, not just for saving my life, but for showing me that I was wrong about the universe. Marcus smiled again. You are welcome. Ambassador Velshara walked out of the medical bay and into the morning light. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that might have been hope in the years that followed. Her leadership style changed in ways that puzzled her peers. And she began honoring agreements even when breaking them would be advantageous. And she promoted based on competence rather than probability. And she cultivated a reputation for reliability that made her invaluable as a diplomatic partner when asked about the transformation. She always gave the same answer: I hired a human. And they are contagious, and in the security office of her estate. Marcus Cole continued his rounds, checking doors and scanning for threats, protecting an alien who had once tried to corrupt him and had instead been changed by what she found. Some things were beyond price. That was what made them valuable, and that was the day Velshara Kiev learned what humans had always known about themselves. That the measure of a person is not what they do when everyone is watching, but what they do when they think no one ever will.